So how do we uncover the strategy? This is Augustine's strategy. If evil is not a thing, then the case against Christianity stated in the original syllogism is unsound because one of its premises is false. So we go back here. All things that God created are good. Evil is not a good. Therefore, evil was not created by God. And this is exactly where Epicurus thought there was a big problem with the idea that if you have a God who's all good, who's all knowing, who's all powerful, but then you have evil, then that just negates the idea of God. So the critical question then we still haven't uncovered that, but what is evil? Augustine was a Manichaean, and a Manichaean had a dualistic perspective. Evil and good, light and dark are two opposing things. So if you think Star Wars, you have exactly the right idea. You have the two forces, the dark force, dark side, and the Jedi way. So dualism is not a winning or satisfying option in the argument of an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God, because then you've got two things that are equally powerful. You can't have that. It doesn't line up. This dualistic idea, the dualistic perspective, doesn't line up with the idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful God, all-loving God. And it creates the problem that Epicurus brought up. Augustine studied many years under the Manichaeans, and the ontological origin of evil and other issues caused him to break from them, and also caused him to spend much of his life on this problem. And I gotta hand it to him, because this is a tough problem to spend much time on. So we go back to, well, what is evil? And so with this foundation, Augustine was now prepared to answer the question, where is evil then? And whence and how crept it in hither? What is its root? And what is its seed, or hath it no being? To this Augustine answered, evil has no positive nature, but the loss of good has received the name evil. So here we go again. This is the idea of privation, and it comes first from the writings of Plotinus, who's a Neoplatonist, as I said. His idea is that Plato had that idea of the dividing line. You have the intellectual or the intelligible world, and then you have the material world. And he said those things, there's like these points of light. Those things are, and he believed that everything was created by God, but then these copies of things actually come after that, and they are less and less like the good. So you get a copy, and then you get a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And then as you keep getting these copies, they get less and less like the original. And the farther you go away, Plato's idea, the farther you go away from that light, you start heading into darkness, and that's when you start looking towards the material instead of the intelligible. And that's going to be a big issue here. So Augustine observed that evil always injures, and such injury is a deprivation of the good. It's a big observation to talk about that. Think about evil. Really spend a day, I don't know if you want to do that, you might be totally depressed by the time you finish, but think about evil and think about what it is. What does it do? What is it like? In its purest form. And he says it always injures, and it's a deprivation of the good. If there were no deprivation, there would be no injury. It's interesting. The only thing that evil can do is take away from the good of something. So even if we talk about sickness, we're talking about the fact that it is less than well. And if we're talking about mental defect, still it's a defect. It's a taking away from what was originally meant to be. And this is something that medieval and ancient philosophers were always talking about, is what is the good for man? What is it like? When we're talking about this standard, this mark, and anything that is below that, then is going to be called an evil, and not in our evil sense, where we're going to talk about that, but that evil is less than the good. There's this hierarchy that you want to attain. So since all things were made with goodness, and that's Augustine's starting point. God is all good, so he creates things with good, and he's not going to go with the Platonist idea that it, copies of copies, but evil must be the privation of goodness. All which is corrupted is deprived of good. So when we talk about punishments, we certainly do this. In our understanding, we have this necessitating factor in restoring what was taken. So anytime you talk about punishment or the evil that someone has done, it really is they've taken something from someone else. They've deprived them of the good. And what we try to do in punishment is restore that to them. And as you can see, some of the cases that we had with Jessica Lunsford, how do you restore that kind of thing? Those are really challenging questions. So the Platonic and Aristotelian ideas really goes back to the function of man. And I've discussed that a little bit. But when a man is fully developed, or a just man for Plato, one is fully actualized for Plato, then this idea of the limited man is that he becomes less and less. One of the things that Augustine hated about the idea that these two things, evil and good, were equal, is he doesn't like that idea, because it kind of gives us that idea of the Tony Soprano. We idolize him, and he's just as powerful as the good Hitler was just as powerful as that. It's not what we want to, what Augustine wants to say. He wants to say, no, look, if you really think about this kind of man, he's limited, very limited. For Plato, Plato thought that you would become depressed, and certainly we see Tony Soprano, who becomes very depressed, and he has to go to his therapist because he's just totally immobilized by all these conflicting desires for the passions that he has internally. And Plato says, yeah, absolutely, that would totally happen to you. But Aristotle thinks that you haven't actualized your potential, the potentia. You haven't done that completely. In fact, you're not even looking to do that completely. Remember, you're supposed to strike that mean for Aristotle, and you're not even really interested. You're just a very limited man. You're less than what a man would be, and that's evil. It's an interesting way to look at evil rather than this kind of idea that we have of it. I'll stop here and go on with the third part.